In 1937, the Nanking incident destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent Chinese people in horrible ways. Even more horrifying, Japan is still claiming that it did nothing wrong. Sadistic abuse, mind-blowing torture, and unspeakable acts of cruelty. Imperial Japanese soldiers committed all these terrible crimes. Welcome to History Uncharted. Today we will show you the most horrifying acts that happened at the Nanking Massacre. Why was there conflict between China and Japan in the first place? In 1937, the main issue between China and Japan was political. China was nationalistic and Japan was hegemonic. Japan wanted to rule Asia. There was no reconciliation between their interests. The Japanese had contempt for other people in general and for women in particular. They enslaved Korean women at the time also. Hundreds of thousands of so-called comfort women were uprooted and enlisted. Japan is denying that too, of course. Japan tried to isolate itself, politically and economically, against the Soviet Union. But China's hardline nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, formed an anti-Japanese united front with the communists. On July 7th, a war broke out in northern China. By August that year, the fighting spread into Shanghai. There was hand-to-hand combat. The Japanese army suffered heavy casualties and there was no end in sight. But by mid-November, the Japanese managed to capture Shanghai. They managed to do so with the help of aerial and naval bombardment. After that, the General Staff headquarters in Tokyo decided to stop their conquest of mainland China due to the high number of casualties and the low morale of their troops. But instead of quitting, they targeted the prosperous and industrial center of Nanking, capital of nationalist China. The population of the city stood at roughly 500,000 civilians and 150,000 soldiers. Nanking was 300 kilometers west of Shanghai, a long, hard, and grueling journey. On December 1st, 1937, the Japanese troops began this campaign to strike terror into the hearts of the Chinese. It was all about militarism, the superior military power of the Japanese Empire. By December 10th, Japanese demanded China's surrender. They dropped leaflets into the city, but there was no response. General Iwani Matsui of Japan then issued the command to take Nanking by force. Japanese commander Prince Yasuhiko Asaka had no plan to stop the carnage. From the very beginning, war was inevitable between the two countries. Faulty Chinese defensive system. China's hardline leader Chiang Kai-shek didn't do anything to help his people. He knew that after the Battle of Shanghai, not much could be done. He knew what was at stake: his elite troops. Chiang didn't want to lose his military forces in battle, so he ordered nearly all his troops to evacuate the city, leaving his own people, his nation, defenseless. Chinese warlord Tang Jiangxi gathered 100,000 soldiers. Most of them were untrained, but these unfortunate soldiers were ordered to fight to their last breath in this doomed city. Chiang also forbade the citizens from leaving the city of Nanking. Some citizens didn't care and still left the city because they feared the Japanese and had little faith in Nanking's remaining defenses. Rich families were able to drive off in their cars. The poor then followed. But thousands of the city's civilians were sadly left behind, including the ethnic Tanka boat people. In total, 3/4 of the population of Nanking left before the Japanese arrived. The others went through and to hell. The plan was to draw Japanese soldiers deep into China. China's vast territory would then be used as a defensive strength, but it was a complete failure. Japanese soldiers pushed retreating Chinese soldiers to the north of Nanking and to the Zijin Mountains in the east, meaning the Japanese completely surrounded the Chinese before squeezing them into oblivion. Christian missionaries. Foreigners lived in Nanking before the invasion, either Christian missionaries or merchants. Most fled the city before the Japanese reached it. 27 outsiders remained. 5 of them were journalists. They only stayed in the city for a few days. Then there were 15. John Rabe, a German businessman and member of the Nazi Party, took control of Nanking during the siege. He and the other foreign businessmen and missionaries created the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. This safety zone for refugees was about the size of New York's Central Park. There were 12 small refugee camps. By December 1st, any remaining citizens of Nanking had to enter the safety zone. He sent a telegram to Chiang Kai-shek to ask Chinese forces not to engage the Japanese. He also sent a telegram to Japanese military leaders asking for a 3-day ceasefire so the Chinese could retreat from Nanking. Chiang Kai-shek said his hands were tied, and the Japanese declined the ceasefire. This sealed the fate of Nanking. On December 11th, Abe discovered that Chinese soldiers hid in the safety zone and placed everyone in danger. They removed their uniforms, threw away their weapons, and hid among Chinese refugees. They were specifically targeted by the Japanese, who regarded them as cowards. The majority of people residing in the safety zone were innocent civilians, but the Japanese troops didn't see it that way. They started throwing grenades into the refugee zone. December 13th, 1937. On this horrifying day, troops of Japan's Central China Front Army began bombing Nanking. Chinese citizens were terrified because they heard of the atrocities that these troops have committed on their way to China. The people of Nanking started drinking heavily, and why not? Even soldiers began drinking, although of course this didn't help their fighting skills. The Japanese soldiers had killing contests, especially with the sword. The target was 100 beheadings each. They pillaged and burned buildings down, hunted down thousands of Chinese soldiers, and made a game out of it. People were left in mass graves. The Japanese troops got exhausted from all the massacring. They lost men on the way, they were hungry and exhausted, so they were out for revenge. They were also running low on supplies. The Japanese troops quickly made their way through Nanking without much of a challenge. This was due to Japanese commanders ordering looting and sexual abuse of anyone they came across. There were no rules or humanity, just insanity. They finally surrounded Nanking and defeated the Chinese garrison stationed there. Nanking was not in a defendable position, so the majority of Chinese troops withdrew. Those who attempted to flee by swimming across the Yangtze River were shot. The world was made aware of the conflict within the first week. Around 40,000 people lost their lives within the first 5 days of the attack. The Japanese took no mercy on civilians. Entire families were wiped off the face of the earth. Not even the elderly or children were spared. Tens of thousands of women and girls were hurt. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women, girls, and elderly women were brutally mistreated. Many didn't survive because they were mutilated after being assaulted. But that wasn't all. The Japanese troops wanted their prizes to be put on display, so they littered the streets with bodies. These bodies were still on display for many months after the attack. But that wasn't enough for the Japanese. They wanted more. Their goal was to completely destroy Nanking. The next step was to loot as much as possible, and lastly to burn down at least a third of all the buildings. The attack lasted for nearly 6 weeks. The surrounding rural counties, Lishui, Zhurong, Jiangning, Jiangpu, Gaochun, and Luhe, were also invaded. The Japanese were trying to minimize the scale of the destruction. Regardless of this, thousands more people lost their lives. Soldiers and civilians alike suffered at the hands of the Japanese. Christian missionary Minnie Vautrin established Ginling Girls' College in the safety zone. She worked hard to welcome thousands of female refugees onto the college campus. She managed to shelter up to 10,000 women. First, the Japanese agreed to respect the Nanjing safety zone. Then they broke their promise. Refugees weren't safe from their vicious attacks. People were still being murdered until the first week of February that year. Ultimately, the safety zone worked. At least 200,000 lives were spared. 155,300 corpses have been buried in and around Nanking, but a total of 200,000 civilians were killed. Then, they appointed a puppet government. They ruled Nanking until the end of World War II in 1944. The aftermath. Till today, the Nanking Massacre is seen as one of the worst wartime atrocities of all time. It is believed that up to 300,000 lost their lives. Damage to the city has been valued at $20 to $30 million at the time. Military barracks, forests, private homes, and villages were burnt to the ground. After the war, high Japanese officials and officers were tried and accused of war crimes by the International Military Tribunal in the Far East. They were found guilty and were soon executed. Japanese military leaders who weren't charged because they were already deceased or they committed suicide. Prince Asaka was spared because he was a member of the imperial family. This granted him immunity from being tried. but Nanking was destroyed. Beijing became the capital of China in 1949. It took decades for Nanking to rebuild itself after the savage attacks. Today, it is home to China's largest state-owned firms. Despite the repairs, the relationship between China and Japan hasn't been repaired. Their relationship remains sour. Japan has tried to convince the world that China has marshaled a propaganda scheme against them. Japanese nationalists, apologists, and historical revisionists have said that China has exaggerated the events that took place as well as the numbers of people who lost their lives. Some have even gone as far as to say that the incident never happened. The victims of the Nanking incident are memorialized at the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall in Nanjing, located close to a mass grave known as the Pit of 10,000 Corpses. Japan gambled on Nanking, causing immense civilian suffering and damaging its national image beyond repair. The Nanking incident demonstrates the corrupt decisions of rulers and the horrific dangers of military power, not just in East Asia, but everywhere. Bear that in mind. This is History Uncharted. See you next time.